Hi everyone, my name is Jordan Marshall. I'm Chief Reporter at Building and I'll be chairing today's discussion. Today's webinar, Speeding Up the Journey Towards Value-Based Decision-Making in UK Construction, is looking to discuss the Construction Innovation Hub's new Value Toolkit, which was unveiled today. The £72 million government-backed R&D program is working to develop a new value toolkit intended to help policymakers and clients make faster and informed decisions that incentivise industry to respond with innovation and high-value solutions. We're really excited about our panel today. We have Keith Waller, Program Director at the Construction Innovation Hub, Anne Bentley, who is the Global Board Director at Ryder Levitt Bucknell and lead on supply chain and business models at the CLC, Neil Robertson, Chief Executive at the National Skills Academy for Rail, Hannah Vickers, Chief Executive at the Association for Consultancy and Engineering, and Huda Assad, Head of Infrastructure Performance at the Infrastructure Projects Authority. First of all, today we're going to get everyone to run through their discussions, and then after that we're going to have a Q&A session. Please feel free to have those questions coming in throughout. We'll also have 3 poll questions spaced throughout the conversation. So without me taking up too much time, I'm going to throw things over to Keith, who will kick us off.
Thanks, Jordan. I think you're going to pass control. So thanks, Jordan. Good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for joining the webinar today to hear about the Value Toolkit. In fact, recently we've all heard from the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Construction Minister, the Construction Leadership Council about the importance of construction and infrastructure in supporting our economic recovery from COVID. We've heard phrases like build back faster, greener, better. So let me be clear, this is not about building cheap and dirty buildings. Because as a society, we care about safe, high quality buildings and infrastructure. We care about design quality, social impact, net zero carbon. We care about whole life value and improved performance from our built environment. And of course, we also care about creating a safe, sustainable, innovative and profitable industry to deliver these ambitions. And I believe that if we think about and define and measure value differently, this is going to be absolutely key to how we can meet those ambitions that we all care about. So the Hub was set up about 2 years ago now with a mission to be a catalyst for the transformation of the sector. But of course, with COVID, we realised that we've also got quite an important role to play in supporting and working with governments and industry in supporting the recovery, consistent, of course, with those long-term ambitions. And you can see on the right-hand side that from our programme, value is just one of our 4 linked thematic areas, and it sits alongside the work we're doing on manufactured buildings, kits and parts, on assurance and on digital as well. And of course, we need to think about value and how it is already sits as part of the sector deal. It's already part of government's ambition through transforming infrastructure performance and ties. And of course, it's now part of the CLC's roadmap to recovery. Value is absolutely crucial to the transformation and the recovery of the sector. So this new value toolkit that we've launched today consists of 4 modules. With new tools in each of those modules. Module 1 at the start is really something that requires to be thought about at the very start of the investment cycle, well before a project is formed. And of course, going through to module 4, where we're measuring value and performance in delivery and the steps in between. And as Jordan said, it's a tool that's aimed at policymakers, at clients, and their advisors and industry as well. And of course, we'll hear from Anne, from Neil, from Hannah and from Huda later. But really, at the very start, it's about defining value, understanding what those key value drivers are. And we've based the approach in the toolkit on the 5 capitals model, natural capital, social, human, manufactured and financial. And for each of those capitals, we're asking clients to decide what's important to them, what are their value drivers, and how do they stack up against each other. And through that process, they will end up with a unique value profile shown on the right-hand side. And those value drivers should articulate and meet the needs of that project for that client in that location. It could be for that investor as well in that project. But it's also not just about the project itself. It's about how do we support those wider ambitions that we have as a society, decarbonising our infrastructure, delivering greater social value, driving innovation, and much more. And of course, we want to see that unique value profile used to inform our decision making as we move forward. And of course, if we defined the profile, we need to index it and start to find a way to measure value as we go through the life cycle to inform our choices and the options, including in procurement. We'll hear more, of course, from Hannah and Anne specifically later. And the questions we should be asking at each of these interventions, at each of these stages is, are we value creating or are we value destroying? How do we improve the value that we're delivering, measured through that value profile, meeting those value drivers, and of course, delivering that wider social, economic and environmental ambition that we have. And of course, as we go through, as we build this data, as we make these decisions, we can start to feed back to understand what works, what is driving value, what are the solutions that really support those ambitions, what perhaps need more work if they are to deliver increased value. And we mustn't think about value just being measured and assessed when we're doing the capital phase of a project. We need to be thinking about how we measure value throughout the whole investment lifecycle. Is it delivering those benefits at the end of construction? Is it meeting the user's aspirations through its operational life? And of course, as we see the investment lifecycle continuing, are we making informed choices about whether we want to upgrade or repair or renovate? And are those decisions being driven by value? So before I let Hannah and Anne and Neil run through a bit more of the detail, I think it's important just to reiterate, we've published this report today, and the Hub, of course, will continue to engage and work with government, industry, and our stakeholders to develop and embed these tools into the future projects that we'll see coming in the weeks and months ahead. But if I could just talk about what success looks like to me. So success will be if we have a much wider understanding of value and how it can be maximised. I'd like clients to really understand and articulate their value drivers and drive towards meeting that real value across the whole investment lifecycle. And of course, I'd like industry to be unleashed to innovate and to drive real value to users and to society and to their businesses, and not be constrained by a narrow focus on cheapness. We need to be thinking about value as the driver of our decision making. And I hope you can share this same ambition and success and will feel inspired to get behind this new value toolkit. So together we can make a real difference and drive better social, economic and environmental outcomes from the investment we make each year in our infrastructure and built environment. So thank you very much, Jordan.
No worries. Thanks very much for that, Keith. Okay, I'm just going to take back control now. And I'm also going to launch one of our polls now. So it'd be really great if we could get all of the audience to answer this one for us. That should be. Excellent. Okay. So Keith, one of the things you mentioned there was COVID-19. Is the whole COVID-19 situation going to make this harder or easier to embed into practice, do you think?
Well, I think the long-term vision of where we need to get to as a sector, that hasn't changed. But I think the urgency to drive to move towards a better way of working, I think has accelerated. So I think this will make it easier. I think we'll find that decisions that may have been harder to make in the past, or people being quite happy with the status quo, often these are barriers to making change. But I think what we're seeing from COVID-19, what we're seeing from the work that the CLC have been doing through their task force, the roadmap to recovery, and of course the statements we've been hearing from the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Construction Minister, are all pointing towards building back greener and faster. So if we are going to transform the sector and support the recovery, many of these ambitions, I think, will be happening much sooner than we might have hoped in the past. Everyone agrees we need to decarbonise. Everyone agrees we need to be more efficient, more innovative. Everyone believes that industry needs to be more sustainable, resilient and profitable. So we have an opportunity now as we come out of the COVID crisis to really sort of accelerate the pace of change and make sure we don't lose sight at the same time of those long-term transformation objectives we have, but also make sure at the same time we're supporting the recovery of the sector and the wider economy.
Okay, excellent. I'm just going to close our poll now. So in answer to our first question, which was based on your experience, do clients consistently set out their key value drivers? Our two answers were yes or no, unsurprisingly, and 18% of people voted yes. So that was, I guess, very much the minority, and 82% voted no. Does that surprise anybody? Okay, I will now start sharing Neil's presentation so that he can get underway. So, sorry, just wanted to... Neil, ready when you are.
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you, Keith, for an excellent and indeed stirring introduction there. And may I add my congratulations to you and your team for the report you've issued and the tool. From our perspective, it's absolutely in the right territory. So I'd like just to, in a sense, take forward particularly Keith's theme of the whole life value here. And tell you a little bit about a project that we're working very closely with the Construction Innovation Hub in the transport infrastructure space. Now, as many of you know, the government is planning, and indeed is spending a lot of money in transport, and is keen to get better value for money from that investment. And the word, we hear the words a lot, laser-like focus on value for money. So I think it's very timely that we have this toolkit and the work that we're doing, and this project is supported by both Innovate UK and the Department for Transport. Next slide, please, Jordan. So we're calling it Living Lab, and the vision here is to really pick up on, in some detail, some of the points Keith was making in his wider sort of review of capital. So we have a view that in transport we are missing efficiencies of up to 40 to 50%, and there are 6 things we think we need to do to particularly address those. It's a slightly different environment from some other construction environments, but of course there's a lot of overlap. And I think if you did that same poll just in relation to transport infrastructure, it would be similar. So what, building on the tip, the Transport Innovation Efficiency Strategy is looking to identify the drivers of cost and value over the whole life, use this intelligence to highlight the best practice and drive innovation. Next slide, please. So there's 2 parts to it. The reason it's called Lab is that we have the work in the background, where we are looking in great depth at whole life costings and benchmarks, and to produce a whole life value picture for a whole range of critical aspects of transport infrastructure construction. So these range right through from unit costs of bits of infrastructure right through to some people costs, or many of the ones in Keith's wheel of natural capital. And then when it comes out of the lab, the living bit is that we have demonstrator projects. Now, these demonstrator projects have been defined by clients as some of the areas that they see particular opportunities for improvement in efficiency, either because of repeatability or the complex nature of them. So I'll just in the next slide give you a slightly greater sense of those, and we'll see how the toolkit applies. So next slide, please, Joe. So footbridges are not the thing that excites everybody, but there's lots of them, and we haven't done the best job in terms of standardizing and creating best value in this space. Cooling the tube is something that many people worry about, and and of course with the global warming and new trains, etc., this is a growing problem. Everybody worries about the safety that we have in the nighttime deployments of staff on mainline and tube line, and of course data is becoming a central part of construction, and it's still quite new, and we're still learning how to do that better. So there's 4 of our demonstrators. Next slide, please, John. And then really to build on these is thinking about how do we pull these together to, we'll use the word catalyst as well as Keith, but at a slightly more technical level, how can we show our clients and stakeholders the validity of this approach and the impact of it? So what we really bluntly want to show is improve the business case for innovation by showing the difference between the whole life costs of doing it the old way and the whole life value of doing it the new way. Next slide, thank you, Jordan. And of course, the benefits are, again, much broader than just cash, although cash is king, and we need to show the treasury value for money, but we're also looking for improvements in safety, of course, environmental issues, the better jobs, and obviously for the passengers and the users of the transport network, then there needs to be benefits for them as well. So in a way, we're taking what Keith has described and applying it in a very specific context, that of transport infrastructure, and we will ensure the interplay between the wider work of the Construction Innovation Hub and this particular project over its 2-year life. And then the last slide tells you the people that are involved, the partners and the sponsors. So thank you very much, Jordan.
Thanks very much for that, Neil. So I'm just going to pop up our next poll question. So everyone should have that now. And while that is launching, I'm just going to get our next presenter, who will be Anne, ready to go. So just switch this to you, Anne. So that should be all fine for you to kick off, and I'll close this in about 30 seconds. But just to kick things off, Anne will be speaking about why it's important that we need to be able to better define our value priorities early on in projects. So if we could just get everyone to cast their votes, that would be really great. Okay, excellent. I'll close that now, and I'll share those results with everybody. They should be on your screens now. So based on your experience, which is the below is the main factor when decision making through the investment life cycle, value and cost. I'm going to take a stab in the dark and guess that our panelists might not be overly surprised by that answer, but does anyone have any comments? Go ahead, Neil.
Part of our preparatory work for the project was to understand, and this was a bit of work that Keith sponsored in his old role, was to understand where has this happened effectively. And one of the environments that have improved productivity in this space was utilities. And the single biggest thing that the chief execs of the utility companies pointed to when asked, how did you make this change? They said we went to a TOTEX approach, where we, of course, added together the CapEx and the OpEx. And that allowed us, in fact, forced us to take a whole life value view of that. And in a sense, that discipline, which is now routine in some other sectors, is one that we really need to emulate here.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I guess we might throw that everything over to you now, Anne, if you want to launch your presentation. That sounds good to me. Anne, I think you might just need to unmute yourself there.
Sorry, there you go. Okay, can you see my presentation? Good, because I can't. So I'm at a bit of a loss now.
I'll take back control. I've got your slides.
Yeah, you take back control and I'll get you to go through the slides. Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, if you move on to the next slide then, please.
There you go.
Okay, so I was asked to sort of give a bit of an overview, maybe sort of a very high level overview as sort of where we were coming from in terms of value, because it's such a misused and abused term that many people, I think, just interchange cost and value. And I actually think that the two poll results have already demonstrated this, that there's just a lack of understanding maybe of what value really means, which is quite strange because I think in all of our personal lives, everybody absolutely understands what value means, but somehow it gets lost in translation when we get into construction. So the first thing I wanted to do was sort of say, well, what do we mean by value in that real widest definition? And this is a slide taken from CABE, the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. And they did research just in terms of the way that buildings affected the building users, if you like. So nothing to do with value in the normal sense of how much did it cost and what did it deliver or whatever, but actually how did it feel to be in? And you can actually see that if buildings are designed properly and if we get the value right, then, you know, we can the building itself can help to speed up recovery. If you're in a hospital, it can improve learning, it can improve productivity, it can help reduce crime rates. And so these are really, really sort of high aspirations that the construction sector should be delivering. If we go into the next slide, please. What I thought was that we needed to look at maybe a few examples of whether they'd done it knowingly or perhaps they'd done it intuitively. Clearly, the commissioners for buildings already knew this. So, you know, Canterbury Cathedral is very different to some system-built housing in the 1950s, which is very different to the most sustainable building in the UK at the moment, which is the Bloomberg headquarters in London. All of whoever, I have no idea who commissioned Canterbury Cathedral, but whoever commissioned these three different projects had really, really well-defined value drivers. You know, the cathedral had to be inspiring and uplifting. The housing had to be, frankly, quick and cheap. And the Bloomberg headquarters had to have, you know, be built for another 100 or 200 years and had to be hugely sustainable. So if we go into the next slide, it's not that we don't understand value, it's more that we have a greater difficulty in defining it. And so quite a lot of the original work that we did at the CLC and that's now sort of, you know, intrinsic to the work that Keith's doing at the Hub was to find examples, real hard examples of where value had actually been included in the procurement process. And what we very quickly found was that if we changed the language to outcome rather than value, it was probably much more easily understood, both by clients, by advisors, and by people working in the industry. And certainly at the time, this is probably 2 or 3 years ago now, one of the best examples that we had of this outcome-based procurement was Anglian Water. And all of their procurement exercises are effectively started off with saying, what is it we're trying to do for our customers? You know, obviously they might be building a pumping station or a reservoir, but actually it's how do they fulfill the requirements of their customers. So there is already some really good practice out there. But if we go into the next slide, and this is really a point Neil made, what we realise, and I think every client does realise this, but maybe we get overwhelmed by the construction process, is that we don't really start to deliver the value until the building's finished. And that's why it's so difficult to measure, of course. You know, 100% of the cost actually of an asset is probably spent during occupational use, but there's absolutely no question whatsoever that 100% of its value only occurs after it's built. And so I think particularly those of us in the sort of who work in the design or the engineering or the quantity surveying functions might then get really bogged down with trying to quantify this very early on in the process, rather than accepting that some of this has to be sort of measured later once the buildings are occupied. If we move on to the next slide, I think one of the reasons for this is that it's really, really complicated. And in fact, one of the things that I really take my hat off to the work that Keith and his team have been doing is they've actually managed to make it look simpler than it probably is. And I think that is a massive credit to the work that's been done there. But, you know, whether you're looking at government policy, whether you're looking at your own sort of policy as a client, whether you're looking at good practice, there are probably 20 or 30 pieces of policy and legislation that clients and advisors have to take on board when they're sort of trying to determine what it is they're building and what they need to take into account. And indeed, you know, where the value might accrue. And I think therein lies the problem, because the sheer complexity of it means that these tend to be done in sort of single iterations, rather than being done together and actually seeing what the knock-on implication of one to the next is. So if you want to go on to the next slide. Any of you that have seen anything that I've ever spoken about before have probably seen this slide before. It's one of my favourite slides, if you can have such a thing. And what this is, it doesn't really matter if you can't read the bit in the middle, but what the left-hand side is the client's analysis of their brief and where they thought the value lay. And what the right-hand side is the quantity surveyor's assessment of the actual tender documents and where the value was actually being spent, and where the money was being spent, not where the value was being spent. And what this clearly shows is that there was a massive difference in interpretation from when the original business case was done to what, by the time the design had been finished and it went out to tender, as to, you know, what produced value for the client, but actually what the client was spending money on. And this is a real life assessment of a real life project. But I think it's probably fair to say that most projects you could draw something, perhaps not as acute as this, but nonetheless you could draw an example like this. So if we go into the next slide, what this is really just showing is that the aim of the work that we're doing with the Hub, and, you know, that obviously the CLC are supporting with the Hub, is really and truly trying to come up with a system where the client stands the best possible chance of hitting this sweet spot. Clearly they want to build what's necessary or desirable. It's got to be viable. Indeed, it's got to be feasible. But at the moment, very few clients have a mechanism to actually test how close they're getting to that sweet spot in the middle. So if we go on to the next slide, again, some of this is sort of ancient history now, but a lot of the work that has been done over the last sort of 2 or 3 years was kicked off by work that I did with the CLC. And again, that was really, really trying to hone in on the fact that we should be looking at outcome-based procurement rather than a sort of input-based procurement, which I think is the main sort of model that's generally used. And indeed, the fact that only 20% of our audience knew what the client's value drivers are suggests that that is true. If we go on to the next slide, please. This is just really a reiteration of what Keith has already talked about. So the fact that I think that this is gaining traction is it is embodied in the construction sector deal. It is actually part of government policy that this procure for value approach should be taken in public sector procurement. And indeed, we're seeing some very good examples of it in private sector procurement as well. So if we go on to the next slide, this is just really, again, a representation of trying to say, all of these things are important, but actually some things are more important than others. And if you are going to get the ultimate value from a project, you really have to accept that some things might have to be traded. So some things are very important, some things are perhaps less important. And only by designing that sort of overall value spectrum for a project will you actually get the outcome that the client desires. So that takes me on to my final slide, and this is just an example of, this genuinely is a photograph of what the client desired. Again, it's a building that RLB works on, it's actually in Sydney. And this costs nearly 3 times per square metre as the typical building for a university. But Dr. Cho Chak wanted something that would be a memorial, and that was effectively what the brief said. And so this is the building that was delivered, and in his eyes, although it was 3 times as expensive as a building that could have been built that fulfilled the functional requirements, he thought this was great value for money. So on that note, I'll hand back to you, Jordan.
Thanks so much, Anne. I think we might jump straight to Hannah now. So Hannah, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Okay. Right, I'll just check you can all see that. Okay. So I'm going to, I guess, build a little bit on some of our previous presenter slides. So in the report that Keith mentioned today, he talked about the publication of a toolkit, or if you like, the statement of intent, I should say, around the development of this toolkit. And the most developed part of that is the definition of value, and being able to quantify, if you like, value and come to market on the basis of contracting and partnering with industry to deliver that value. So that has unlocked, if you like, quite a fundamental shift in how we are able to actually structure our delivery models. So I'm going to sort of, if you like, pick up from assuming the client has used the first tool in Keith's toolkit and popped out with the definition of value, and just take you through a few slides on the second module in Keith's toolkit, which looks at actually how do you structure your route to market in a way that builds on that. And so it's at its early stages of thinking, so it's lovely to be able to share it, but equally I don't have all the answers. And one of the asks of the audience really would be to say, this is the direction of travel, but please do feel free to input and share and bring, you know, your own research to me around this. So the first thing to say is that this is unsurprisingly a really complex area. You know, we think that when you get the client's definition of value quantified, that it would be very simple to then take it to market. It's not quite that simple, because you soon start to realise that as well as the value definition, you've got a number of other factors that will impact or influence the delivery model choice. It's, you know, very simple if you're someone like an Anglian Water that has, you know, that TOTEX flexibility, that has a sort of long-term regulatory cycle, that has quite a lot of repeatability in your programme. Actually, if you're a house builder or you're a local authority buying a school, your definition of value, but a number of other factors such as your client capability will be quite different. So we started to look at this and realised that actually, you know, it's not just the panacea of the value definition, albeit that's the most important enabler. So I thought I'd just pause here and say, look, why is it important for us to have this second phase in the tool around taking the taking the definition of value and putting some structure, if you like, around how clients might take that to market? You know, you'd think the clients could pick that up and do it themselves. So there is some evidence here that we're basing this on, that is actually going to, you know, if you've got that clear definition of value, you will end up with a better contracting relationship. You will end up with a better project at the end of it, you know, touching a bit on what Neil was showing with the TIES programme. The second thing is it's going to be faster. So what we're aiming for here is to standardise this, recognising it's a very complex area, is to try to take the definition of value and, if you like, standardise how you select your delivery model based on that, meaning that actually the clients will move through that process more quickly and they'll be able to, if you like, have more mature conversations with the supply chain, because, you know, part of this is to look at standardising the list of options that the client can choose from. So again, it gives the market a much better chance to understand what they're being asked to compete on, and therefore increasing competition. And lastly, one of the big drivers in this is to build into this selection process and this development of the commercial strategy a better understanding of risk, and in particular the industry's capability to be able to mitigate risks. So you know, we've touched on it a little bit in some of the other presenters' slide, but actually being able to bring together both sides, both parties, if you like, around an understanding of who can mitigate the risks to delivering the client's mean that we end up with much fairer commercial relationships. We don't get risk transferred or held on to, actually, where either party has got a role or an ability to be able to mitigate it. So just to give you a bit of a sneak peek, and I will caveat this heavily and say this is definitely not something that is fully formed yet, but just to be brave and put it out there. So this module, this second module of Keith's toolkit, is focused on two parts. The first part of it focuses on taking the client through how they would select their delivery model from this standardized list. And the second part works for the client to guide them through how to develop their commercial strategy. So, as Anne touched on in her presentation with her 2 pies, you don't get that mismatch between client having a clear definition of value and actually ultimately what they contract for with the market and what gets delivered being something entirely different. So this process really, in this tool, in the second module, is really focused on, if you like, bridging that valley of death. So I'm going to just take you through some of the emerging thinking. It won't take too long. Right. So the first part is around the selection of the delivery model, and recognizing we have an interesting mix of terminology here. I thought it was helpful just to define what that was. But what we're seeking to do with this is to, if you like, catalogue the potential delivery models. And you'll see some of them up there on the screen, traditional delivery, design and build, alliancing, so Project 13 type approaches, but also new, some new delivery models we think could come on stream, like the platform approach, one sort of commercial model for multiple projects, if you like. What we're looking to do with this tool is actually to have that standardized list and then walk the client through a series of stages. You see with the conveyor belt at the bottom, walk the client through a series of stages to make sure that you're kind of narrowing down on the delivery model that best meets your value drivers, that best fits your risk profile, fits with your client criteria, things you can't change necessarily around your funding, around how experienced your team is, and then gives you the chance to test that with the market in quite a structured way. So that's the premise of this tool. Again, the piece that we've started with is to look at the evidence-based, if you like, the cause and effect between those factors and the different delivery models, because this is the bit where we'll get speed into the process. If we can, for example, put an evidence base together that says a certain value profile, it might be net zero, maps really well to a platform-based approach, immediately you start to get much better decision making and better informed decision making by the clients, because they have, if you like, the evidence base of where the capability sits sitting behind this decision tool. So it would take you through the sort of value definition and your value drivers, and again, if you like, cross off a few delivery models at that stage, and you look at your risk profile. And again, this is about balancing risk between the client and the supply chain in a way that incentivizes, if you like, the markets to help you mitigate that risk rather than just transfers it. There are the client criteria that, as you say, kind of moving through, you're crossing off more delivery models all the time. The client criteria there, the sort of, whether you've got a long-term interest in the asset, for example, will again influence your choice of delivery model. And then finally, being able to actually go to market. And interesting, this is an area where you're going to have quite a sort of live conversation at the moment, in particular because we've got COVID impacting on things like the market's appetite, like the market's capacity. So, a really important step to have that market engagement before you sort of close off in the delivery model choice. So that's the first part, and I said not completed, so that's where we're thinking with that, is that each of those steps will be very evidence-based. But if I move forward now into the commercial strategy development, and just give you again a very sneak peek here, but what we're looking at in this phase, and this is a sort of second tool that would come in to support the clients, is really to start to help the clients take decisions around how they package. So this is where you draw in industry business models and hopefully shifting more towards sort of output and outcome based business models, those sorts of contract incentives, those sorts of revenue models. So again, what we're looking to do here is standardize the choice that you have around the business models from industry, to structure that conversation with the client in a better way, and again overlay how you would take that through defining your contracts, what sort of incentives you would put in place, all actually made possible by the fact that you've got a quantifiable definition of value up front, which you would flow down through the packaging strategy and into the contract themselves, and into how you actually go and sort of pay your supply chain, if you like. The incentives mechanism should be on a sort of output and an outcome basis. But the real point here is that you get that alignment. It's a very logical walk through. So finally, I thought, although I've thrown a lot of diagrams at you and a lot of confusing terminology perhaps there, it's all in the document that Keith referenced. I have a read at your leisure. It's still a work in progress, but if I had to put on one slide what we're trying to do here is we're trying to create something that helps clients make rational choices. Anne touched on the fact that we don't struggle with the definition of value in our personal lives. So this is my perfect car, and actually that was quite an easy decision for me. I don't have a lot of young children to put in the back of it. I quite like to go faster, and it's pretty stylish and it's nice and green. But actually, I have absolutely no knowledge in designing a car, in buying a car, in the supply chain associated with delivering a car. But what I can do is go on to Aston Martin's website and they'll configure it for me. And I think really that's what we're trying to do here, is to help clients when they've got that definition of value, configure their Aston Martin and come to market in a way that means that they get a nice, shiny, impressive green Aston Martin at the end of it, if that's what they really want. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but as I said, we're at the start of our journey, and I'm very happy to collaborate with those on the call to develop this as we move over the next 6 months of the programme. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Hannah. That was great. I think what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to get Huda to say a few words, but I might run the last poll question while you're introducing yourself and give me a bit of a rundown, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you for that. Do you want to do the poll first?
No, it's okay. Everyone can answer while you talk, and then I'll close it while you're chatting.
Great, thank you. So my name is Huda Asad, and I work at the IPA. I head up infrastructure performance, and I just wanted to say that as government have been co-chairs of the CLC and have been long-term supporters of the Procuring for Value workstream run by Anne, we are quite excited to be able to support the development of a toolkit to be able to make sure that it works for government, to help us to build back better, greener, faster, while supporting a more sustainable, productive, and competitive industry. And this focus on value linked to the outcomes that we care about is incredibly helpful as we start to document and put a lot of these initiatives in place through Project Speed, and in our definitions of value for money in a more pragmatic view, in having more consistent contractual terms and conditions, rationalized client requirements, and creating more consistent win-win commercial relationships with industry as a client.
Great. Okay, I'm just going to quickly share these poll results, and then we'll get straight into the Q&A. So that's those, and I'll just hide them now. Did they come as a surprise to anybody? That might be a good way for us to kick off. So if everyone can make sure their mics are unmuted, and we can get into it.
I don't have to surprise Jordan on those results. I mean, I think that's the feedback we've been getting when we've been speaking to clients, to contractors, to consultants. They want to be able to deliver faster, better buildings and infrastructure. Let's help them. Okay,
so we've got a ton of questions coming in. I'll do my best to get through as many as we can. I have to group a few, go a bit thematically, but we'll try and cover off as much as we can. But first off, what does success look like for this toolkit? Like, how much uptake are you expecting?
Do you want me to start off with that, Jordan?
Yeah, that'd be great. Kick us off, Keith.
In the UK, we spend each year around about £65 billion on our economic and social infrastructure. That's schools, prisons, hospitals, highways, energy. So success to me is we use it on about £65 billion of that. Now, I don't think we're going to get there overnight, and there is a journey to go through. But if we can demonstrate through some of the early projects we're going to be working with in social infrastructure that it is delivering better outcomes, we expect to see some uptake. So we're targeting all of it. So we think that's how we help support a transformed sector and deliver better outcomes.
Does anyone else have anything they want to chip in on that one, or should we jump to the next question?
Perhaps similarly immodest, Jordan, we're taking a slightly different view, which is that instead of looking at the spend in the way that Keith is, we're thinking more around the productivity improvements, and that we see in the bit that we are looking at in transport infrastructure, up to 30% improvement. So success looks like a 30% reduction in unit costs over time.
Okay, awesome. We've had a few questions coming in, given that procurement legislation is set to change with the impending exit from the EU. And so is this an opportunity to sort of embed value into that procurement legislation that is going to have to be rewritten anyway? Anyone have any thoughts? Anyone want to jump in on that? Anne? Oh, Anne, you're still muted, I think.
Okay, thank you. Sorry. Yeah, we both muted me, I think. I mean, the simple answer to that has to be yes. I know that Cabinet Office have actually, I mean, some time ago now, had commissioned a study into what new procurement regulations should be, not just for construction, I mean, generally outside of the EU. And certainly, I think that's gaining momentum with, you know, sort of mentioned Project Speed earlier, the sort of government build program, and how can we actually use construction as a sort of economic lever, and that will put even more pressure on procurement, to be honest. So there's absolutely no question that there is an intent to ensure that procurement changes for the better. My only concern though is that speed doesn't overtake us. And instead of sort of spending a little, because I mean, my sort of whole approach, and certainly the approach I know the Hub are taking, is you probably have to spend a little bit more time up front to make sure that you actually get the value downstream. And so I do have a fear that that sort of desire just to do things incredibly quickly could mean that some of that upfront planning is lost. So yes, but we have to be careful that we don't go so fast that we lose that opportunity.
I think it's worth also adding on top of what Anne said that we should be aware that government procurement rules, the way government assesses business cases, entirely allow you to consider whole life value and wider benefits. And again, the feedback we've had is that whilst the rules say you can do that, they're not always followed in a complete and consistent way. And Hannah talked about alignment in her presentation, and quite often some of that vision that sits at the start in the of a policy idea sometimes gets lost or diluted as we go through the various stages. So there's nothing stopping us at the moment considering all of these things in the way we're describing. I do think though that EU exit and changing of procurement regulations may help do that in a more joined up and consistent way, but there's nothing stopping us doing it at the moment at all.
We do have a sorry, Neil, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to come in behind that with an example. I don't think that I don't think that the legislation is the primary problem, but I think again it could be helpful. I think one example you would give, at the risk of sounding slightly technical, is that HS2 will be, as you know, is proceeding, and one of its investments is in slab track. Slab track is more expensive than ordinary track, but lasts a lot longer. So there is a big investment which has been protected, and I hope continues to be protected, because that's been a great example of, or a better example of whole life value costing under the existing legislation.
We do actually have a question here of that sort of basis of, clients' goals, and one of them is, what happens if a client's goal is just short-term and profit-driven? Like, what if their aim is to build a bunch of storage warehouses, and
I think
that's fine. I mean, yeah, so long as the client can define that that's what they want to do, then actually that makes everything very straightforward. We're not suggesting, and certainly nothing that I think any of us has put forward is suggesting that everybody should build Canterbury to the cathedral every time. That Arley housing in my example, that was meant to be quick and cheap. That's why that was built, because people were coming home from the war and had nowhere to live. So I don't think any of us are saying that there's a certain standard. What we're saying is that whatever the standard is has to be defined. Whatever the value driver is has to be defined, and then you should get the best possible one within the definition of that value driver.
And I think on top of that, that's quite right. So the client should make the choices that suits their project, their need, their region. But there are wider ambitions we have in terms of a path to net zero or delivering social impact. These might be benefits that do not accrue directly to the client or the user or the owner or the operator, but society at large. And if government policy says we want a path to net zero and we want to support UK industry, we want to deliver better social impact, then it's very unlikely that public sector projects will be allowed to fly right in the face of that. There's a presumption in favour of off-site construction. So methods that ignore them are unlikely to get funded and approved in the same way. So it's a balance between what the client wants. If they want a memorial facility in Australia, that's fine, as long as it ties in with the broader policy objectives of those people who are providing the funding and the money.
On that point, we do also have a question about how we can drive long-term value for public projects beyond the political election cycle. How do you keep that going when it's a long-term project spanning multiple different administrations?
So that is one of the threads of the work that is currently being undertaken with Project Speed, to look at how we make sure that the outcomes we want to deliver for UK PLC and the citizens of this country remain apolitical and are still sort of driving the right projects.
Does anyone else have any?
And I completely agree with that, Huda, and I think actually that's an area where the IPA is sort of uniquely placed to do that piece of work, to try and influence, owning the assurance process on the business cases. I do think that there is something in here about it being quantifiable as well, because that is far more robust in your project business case. We are seeing a lot of projects now that, because they feel constrained by the economic appraisal that sits within the particular department, it means that they are not appraising the wider benefits that may accrue from, skills and upskilling, particularly long-term projects, or the regeneration, for example, for certain big railway projects you can imagine, that don't feature in the business cases. So I think it's sort of that part as well, because actually if you get a really holistic view and quantification of value into the business case, it makes it much harder for any politician to argue against. If it's like adding extra strings to the bow of the project.
Yeah, just following Hannah, that's exactly what the Living Lab project's about. Is you can't blame politicians for going for the cheaper option if you can't properly demonstrate the value in the more expensive option, and that's why we need to do more of this kind of work. So there's some great examples, but it's not normal because we're not that good at doing the whole life value. Which is why we need this project. We wouldn't need this project if it came naturally, as it were. But I think what's telling is that, as Hannah says, it's getting to the point where people start to understand the need for it, or even, dare I say, accept the need for it.
Great. We also have a few quick practical questions that I might just throw out while we have this opportunity. So one of them is, can the value toolkit be reapplied to existing projects in the design, execution, operational phases, or is it just for new projects from inception?
It's a through life tool. So yes, it can be applied at any stage of the project on existing projects. And if you understand as a client what your value drivers are, and you have to make a choice on an operational project, do I upgrade it? Do I replace it? it will help you make the right choice based on whether is it value creating or value destroying. So yes, any stage.
There's also a question about who in the supply chain and the project team should be using this toolkit. Is it for a QS? Is it for the client specifically? A contractor is going to be using it. Whereabouts is that engagement meant to come from?
So in the document itself, that we've talked about the 4 modules that run through from value definition through the delivery model, commercial strategy, in procure for value, and that ongoing measurement. And each of those different stages, each of those different modules, there are perhaps different people using it. So it may well be policymakers, clients, and advisors in the first stage, and then we start stepping through industry getting involved as well in stage 2. And then, of course, we did mention also the data that comes out of this on how we're doing on value is not just useful to the client, it's also useful back to policymakers and departments and investors, so they can understand what works for them. So we expect policymakers also to be involved at the end. But we've set out who we think the various modules are aimed at in the various parts of the toolkit in the document we published today.
Another one sort of on a similar but slightly related note is, how do you ensure that notion of value is shared and captured throughout the whole supply chain? So it's not just the top of the supply chain benefiting from.
Oh, that's a really important point. I think, Hannah, you've got some stuff on incentivization in the module you're working on. Perhaps you want to pick that one up.
Yeah, no, it's really, it's a really challenging one. But some of it is in the structure of the delivery model, because you would pull different parts of the supply chain closer to the client, depending on which delivery model you pick. So there may be, I think, some disruption to the tiers with certain delivery models that we end up with, because actually what you're trying to do is if you like, grab those bits of the market that are delivering the best value for your particular definition closer to you. So I think we'll see perhaps a little bit of disruption for that. So maybe there's less need, certainly for the sort of high value areas, to be cascading it down multiple tiers. But equally, part of what we're going to deliver is this business models catalogue, which will sort of set out, if you like, how the different elements of the industry plug together, and gives you the guidance on cascading what would be the sort of client central metrics into things that are manageable at a contract level, and into things that you can then test and check and monitor as a client out through the supply chain as well. So what's really important is that the metrics that are used in this are things that drive the right behaviours, and therefore will be cascaded in the contracts down through the industry. So that's what we're working quite hard on.
Excellent. Then we also have one more sort of future gazing a little bit. In a dream scenario, 5 years from now, how different will the industry look because of if we are able to transform notions of value and embed these practices properly in the sector?
Well, can I start off? No, Neil, you go, Neil.
Well, mine's dead simple, Keith. Yours will be much more visionary. I want some decent cost benchmarks and value benchmarks across all our major investment items.
I'll go there. I think we're not going to transform the entire industry, every single client, every single project in the next 5 years, but we're going to make progress. So in 5 years' time, I'd like to see better value buildings being delivered that are more sustainable and ethical because we're using this. But also, I would like to see main contractors on average making at least a 5% margin and a bigger margin for the specialists and the consultants pro-rated. I think this will help industry unlock value and profitability and make them attractive places to work and industry to join. We have perhaps a more diverse workforce that better reflects the society we serve. So I want to see changes in the business models of industry, in the profitability of industry and the attractiveness of industry, if we're able to attract people who are interested in better social value, the path to net zero, rather than how cheap can I build it and how much risk am I willing to take as a company.
I mean, I would add to that I think we should see a much less adversarial industry as well, because if everybody's actually working towards that common incentive of increasing value, then it will almost force people to be collaborative, because that's how you're going to deliver the best value. So we're not trying to do much, are we? We're trying to make the world a better place. I think in summary is Keith's aspiration, yes.
Yeah.
The only thing I would, sorry. I was going to say, the thing that I would add to what I've heard, and I wouldn't comment on margins, but is to have a more resilient industry, having an industry that is able to remain competitive on the international marketplace, that is much more productive, that inspires young people to want to join, and is something of a legacy that we continue forward with, rather than sort of leaving it to keel over, as I sometimes feel we may have done in the past.
I think definitely that's very important, Heather, and completely agree the sentiment. I'm very laudable to hear that from governments. From the industry perspective, I would like to see us going from starting to think about delivery model to contracting in half the time. I think if we can streamline that, and we can because we can standardize it, we should be going out much more quickly. And when we get there, I'd like it to be with a market that is paid, understands the client's definition of value, and they are paid and incentivized to deliver that. So that's where in 5 years' time we need to be, I think, with these projects that will be coming through this toolkit.
Okay, I'm unfortunately going to have to wrap us all up there. So I'm just going to pop up some contact details on the screen for everybody. Thank you so much to all our panelists and to everybody who's joined us today. It's been a really great conversation. We've got so many questions still coming in, so we'll try and get those across to appropriate people so that they can at least know where the big questions are. I'm hoping that we can get some of those answered for you. And yeah, just thank you all for joining in today.
Thank you. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.